For more than 3,000 years, historians believed they knew how the story ended. The Mycenaeans had vanished, their palaces burned, their kings disappeared, their writing system was lost, and one of the most powerful civilizations of the Bronze Age simply faded into history. At least that's what everyone thought. But a recent investigation involving archaeology, genetics, and thousands of years of buried evidence has uncovered something shocking. The Mycenaeans may never have disappeared at all, and if that's true, then one of history's greatest mysteries was built on a misunderstanding. Because the real question may not be where the Mycenaeans went. The real question is why we ever believed they were gone. To understand how strange this story is, we need to go back more than 3,000 years. At the height of their power, the Mycenaeans ruled much of mainland Greece. Massive stone fortresses crowned hills. Warriors controlled trade routes across the Aegean. Gold-filled royal tombs. Foreign kings exchanged gifts with Mycenaean rulers. Their influence stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a small kingdom. This was one of the superpowers of the Bronze Age. Yet there was something unusual about their success. The entire system depended on connections, ships, trade, administration, communication. Everything was linked together. And systems built on connections can become fragile. Because when one part fails, the damage spreads. At first, nobody noticed the danger. Trade still flowed, palaces still functioned, merchants still crossed the sea, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming, and historians still debate exactly what those cracks were. Was it climate change? Was it famine? Was it war? Was it rebellion? Or was it something even larger? The answer remains one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. What we do know is that around 1200 BC, disaster struck across the eastern Mediterranean. Not just in Greece, everywhere. Kingdoms collapsed, cities burned. Trade routes disappeared, empires weakened, entire regions entered chaos. And then the Mycenaean world began to fall apart. One palace after another was destroyed. Some were burned, some abandoned, some never recovered. Within only a few generations, the system that had dominated Greece for centuries was gone. And this is where the mystery begins. Because archaeologists expected something else. They expected the people to disappear too. But they didn't. Villages remained occupied, fields were still farmed, communities continued living in the same regions. Life became harder, poorer, smaller. But it continued. That raised a troubling question. If the Mycenaean civilization died, why were Mycenaean people still there, or were they? For decades, nobody could answer. Archaeologists could excavate houses, they could study pottery, they could analyze weapons, but they couldn't identify ancestry. A broken vase cannot tell you who someone's descendants became. A ruined palace cannot reveal what happened to the people who escaped. And that meant one crucial piece of the puzzle remained missing. Then something changed. A scientific breakthrough gave researchers a tool historians had never possessed before. Ancient DNA. Suddenly, bones buried for thousands of years could tell their own story. Scientists could compare ancient populations with living people. They could track migrations. They could measure ancestry. They could follow biological connections across entire civilizations. For the first time in history, researchers had a way to investigate what happened after the collapse. And what they discovered was completely unexpected. Because the first DNA results created a problem. A very big problem. The evidence did not support extinction. In fact, it suggested almost the opposite. The genetic signature of the Mycenaeans wasn't disappearing. It was surviving. And the deeper scientists looked, the more difficult it became to explain why. How could a civilization collapse so completely, yet leave behind so many descendants? Where exactly had those people gone? Had they migrated? Had they merged with neighboring populations? Or had historians spent more than a century looking for a disappearance that never actually happened? The answer would force researchers to rethink everything they thought they knew about the end of the Bronze Age. Because the story of the Mycenaeans was not turning into a story about extinction. It was becoming a story about survival. And the next discovery would make that impossible to ignore. If the Mycenaeans really survived, then historians faced an uncomfortable question. What exactly collapsed around 1200 BC? Because something clearly did. The evidence was everywhere. Burned palaces, abandoned administrative centers, destroyed fortifications, lost writing systems. The end of international trade. Something enormous had happened. Yet the more researchers investigated, the stranger the picture became. At first, many believed there had to be a single cause, a massive invasion, a powerful enemy, one catastrophic event. After all, how else could so many civilizations collapse at nearly the same time? Then archaeologists began comparing evidence from across the Mediterranean. And that simple explanation started falling apart because the same pattern appeared everywhere. The Hittites collapsed. Major cities in the Levant suffered destruction. Egypt narrowly survived multiple crises. Trade routes that had connected entire continents suddenly broke down. This wasn't a Greek problem. This was a Mediterranean-wide disaster. But who caused it? For decades, one theory dominated discussions. The Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian records describe mysterious groups arriving by land and sea. Warriors, migrants, entire populations on the move. Some historians believed they were responsible for the destruction of Bronze Age civilizations, and for a while that explanation seemed convincing, until a new problem appeared. The timeline didn't fully fit. Some cities collapsed before the Sea Peoples arrived. Others fell without any evidence of invasion. Still others showed signs of internal decline long before any attack. Suddenly, the invaders looked less like the cause and more like part of a larger crisis. Then researchers uncovered evidence of severe droughts, crop failures, food shortages, population stress, trade disruptions. The picture grew even more complicated. Imagine an ancient world completely dependent on international trade. Tin from one region, copper from another, luxury goods from distant kingdoms, food moving across hundreds of miles. Now imagine several of those links breaking at the same time. The entire system begins to wobble, and once enough connections fail, collapse becomes unavoidable. That may be exactly what happened. Not one disaster, many disasters. Not one enemy, multiple crises striking simultaneously, and highly connected civilizations were the most vulnerable. The Mycenaean world was one of them. The palaces controlled everything. Taxes, storage, trade, administration, military organization. When those palaces fell, the entire system collapsed with them. But here's the critical detail. The system died. The people didn't. And that distinction would eventually become the key to solving the mystery. As archaeologists continued excavating Greece, they noticed something that didn't match the extinction theory. The landscape wasn't empty. Far from it. People continued living in many of the same regions. Some settlements shrank. Others relocated. But human life continued. That observation raised another question. If the population remained, how much of the Mycenaean population actually survived? For decades nobody knew. Then, ancient DNA entered the investigation. Scientists extracted genetic material from Mycenaean burials. The process was difficult. Most ancient DNA degrades over time. Heat, moisture, and bacteria destroy genetic information. But some samples survived. Enough to begin building a genetic profile, and when researchers compared those genomes with other ancient populations, they made an important discovery. The Mycenaeans were not an isolated people. Their ancestry was already a mixture. Most of it traced back to early farming populations that had lived in the Aegean for thousands of years. But another component came from populations connected to the Eurasian steppe. That combination created a unique genetic signature, a biological fingerprint. And that fingerprint gave scientists something they had never possessed before, a way to track the descendants of the Mycenaeans. At first, researchers expected the signal to fade dramatically after the Bronze Age collapse. If the Mycenaeans had disappeared, Their genetic profile should become rare, maybe even vanish entirely. But that isn't what happened. The signal remained. Again and again, scientists found traces of the same ancestry in later populations, not only in Greece, in neighboring regions as well. That discovery created a new mystery, because if the Mycenaeans survived, where exactly did they go? Some clues pointed towards Cyprus, and Cyprus would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. After the collapse of the Bronze Age world, archaeologists noticed a sudden increase in Aegean influence on the island. Pottery styles changed, architecture changed, burial customs changed. Entire communities appeared connected to the Greek mainland. For years, historians debated whether this represented trade or migration. Then DNA entered the picture once again, and the results suggested that real people had moved, not just ideas, not just goods, families, communities, survivors, people, escaping a collapsing world. The implications were enormous, because for the first time, scientists could see the human side of the collapse. Not kingdoms, not palaces, not political systems, not people. And what happened next would become even more surprising, because evidence from Cyprus was only the beginning. Another population was about to reveal one of the most unexpected connections in the entire Bronze Age collapse story. If Cyprus proved that people from the collapsing Mycenaean world had migrated, another discovery would take the story even further. The Philistines. For centuries, historians argued about where they came from. Ancient Egyptian records described foreign groups arriving in the eastern Mediterranean during the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeologists noticed something strange almost immediately. Early Philistine pottery looked familiar, very familiar. In fact, some of it looked remarkably similar to Mycenaean pottery. The shapes, the decoration, the manufacturing techniques. The similarities were difficult to ignore, but similarities are not proof. Trade can spread. Styles, merchants can spread ideas. Copied pot does not prove migration. For decades, the debate continued. Then genetics entered the investigation, and once again, the evidence forced historians to reconsider what they thought they knew. DNA recovered from early Philistine burials revealed something unexpected. A detectable genetic component linked to Southern Europe and the Aegean world. Suddenly, the archaeological clues made sense. The people arriving in the Levant were not simply copying Mycenaean culture. Some of them likely carried ancestry connected to the same world that had just collapsed. Not a massive replacement of populations, not a giant invasion, something more realistic. Groups of migrants, refugees, warriors, families, searching for survival. And that changed the entire narrative, because the Bronze Age collapse no longer looked like a story of disappearance. It looked like a story of movement. People were not vanishing, they were relocating, adapting, merging with other populations, creating new societies. And the deeper scientists looked, the clearer that pattern became. Wherever the Mycenaean world fractured, people survived. Some stayed in Greece, some moved to Cyprus. Others reached distant shores. But the biological line continued, and then researchers asked the most important question of all. What happened to the people who remained in Greece? Because if the Mycenaeans truly survived, traces of their ancestry should still be visible today. This was the ultimate test. The answer could either support the continuity theory or destroy it completely. Scientists compared ancient Mycenaean genomes with those of modern Greek populations. The results were remarkable, not because the populations were identical. They weren't. 3,000 years of history had left countless genetic influences. Romans, Slavs, Albanians, Byzantines, Ottomans, merchants, migrants, empires, all left traces. Yet beneath those layers, researchers found something unmistakable. Continuity, the biological thread connecting the Bronze Age and modern Greece had never fully broken. Think about what that means. The people who built Mycenae, the people who walked through the Lion Gate, the people whose world inspired the legends later associated with the Trojan War. Their Ancestry did not vanish. It survived the collapse. It survived invasions. It survived migrations. It survived 3,000 years of history. And that realization changes the entire mystery, because suddenly the question itself begins to look wrong. For over a century, historians asked, where did the Mycenaeans go? But what if that was never the right question? What if the real question is, why did we assume they disappeared? After all, when Rome fell, Romans did not vanish. When kingdoms collapse, populations usually remain. When governments disappear, families continue living. Yet for some reason, the Mycenaeans were treated differently. The burned palaces created an illusion. The destruction was so dramatic that many people unconsciously assumed the population vanished with it. DNA tells a different story. The civilization died, the people survived, and that distinction may be the most important lesson in the entire investigation, because civilizations are not buildings, they are not palaces, they are not royal dynasties. Civilizations are people. When the palace at Pylos burned, people escaped. When Mycenae declined, families remained. When writing disappeared, children still grew up, married, and had descendants. History remembers the destruction. DNA remembers the survivors, and those survivors carried the story forward. Perhaps not consciously, perhaps not through written records, but through generations, one after another, for 30 centuries. That is why the final conclusion of this investigation is so powerful. The Mycenaeans did not disappear at the end of the Bronze Age. They did not vanish into myth. They did not simply become a mystery buried beneath ruins. Instead, they adapted. They migrated. They merged. They survived. Their kingdoms collapsed. Their trade networks collapsed. Their political system collapsed. But the people endured. And in many ways, that is far more remarkable than the rise of their civilization. Empires rise and fall all the time. Survival is rarer. 3,000 years ago, a crisis shattered the Mediterranean world. Cities burned. Kingdoms vanished. Entire civilizations entered darkness. Yet beneath the chaos, ordinary people kept living, farming, traveling, raising families, passing life to the next generation. And because they did, the Mycenaeans never truly left history. Their story did not end in fire. It continued in the people who came after them. The greatest surprise was not discovering where they went. The greatest surprise was discovering they had been here all along. Hidden, not in lost cities, not in forgotten tombs, not in ancient legends, but in the living descendants of the world they helped create. And that may be the most extraordinary archaeological discovery of all.